Good morning. Thank you for being with us today and listening to us online. My name is Irina Ivanchenko. I'm the communication manager of the ZMINA Human Rights Center. Today we are presenting quite complex report on how Ukraine punishes for cooperation with the enemy, who Ukraine considers to be traitors, what approaches are used, and what are the current issues with the legislation in Ukraine, and what kind of solutions do we have? And how can we avoid these kind of cases? So today we are going to talk on how Ukrainian media are talking about collaborationism, and we will separately discuss the situation with the temporary occupied territories and the request, the demand for justice and punishment for collaborating with the enemy. I would like to introduce our speakers. Inna Vyshnevska, from Minister from the Center of Internal Affairs. We have today Weronika Volkovinska, the head of the Department on the Work with the platform Semantrum. Inna Vyshnevska, the scientific worker of the Scientific Laboratory of Lviv State University of Internal Affairs, the expert of ZMINA, and Maxim Yeliguashvili, expert of the Institute of Peace and Common Ground, the co-author of the report, and me, Onisia Sanyuk, the legal analytician of the Center of Rights of Human Rights, ZMINA. And also you can find the report on zmina.ua, our report in the top report. So let's start. What I would like to say, our center ZMINA studies the issues of the responsibility for collaborationism for quite a few years, and in 2023 we audited an analytical report on how legal legislation works with these kind of cases, but nevertheless this year we decided to have even a more complex research, and we are going to talk about it a bit later. So I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Onisia Sanyuk, who will tell us why this report and how it is different from the previous one. Onisia, I know that the previous research has shown that Ukrainian legislation is quite, so to say, it has some kind of issues. The definition of who can be considered collaborator is very wide, and some people do not understand what can be prosecuted and what kind of actions are considered to be the crime. Lisa, could you tell us what did you find out new? What are the current tendencies? What kind of gaps in the legislations do we see now, and what should we pay attention to? Thank you. So, in fact, we are focused on studying this question in dynamics, meaning that the previous report was ended on the period of September 2023, and therefore the new report covers the period from September 2023 until 2024. So we wanted to see whether the tendencies are the same, and considering the fact that we have more practice, because in the previous report period we had 721 cases, and now we have almost 1,400. So the situation is changing quite rapidly, and we have to understand what is changing and whether it is actually changing. So the current observations are quite interesting. So first of all, we can consider, for example, the ratio on what kind of parts of the Article 111.1 are made. Mainly it is part 1, which means public support or and mainly it is in a social network. And also as for the 5th and the 7th part, we have more cases compared to 2023. Now we have more parts. That are the parts which are related to taking the positions in the authorities with the temporary occupying government, and also another dynamics we're observing at the moment that are the cases which are considered in absented. In the previous case, we saw around 50% of them were rendered by absentia, and now we have more of them. That is, in Article 5 and 7, we can see that more than 70% of cases are considered in absentia, and of course it affects the practice, because in absentia cases, typically there is the highest level of punishment or the closest one to the highest one, and otherwise the punishment is much softer. Another general observation is a question of the agreements, the tendency to conclude plea agreements is the opposite, and I think that it is related to the fact that to the part 5 and 7, and typically it is also due to in absentia proceedings, because if we are doing the in absentia proceeding, it is impossible to have an agreement. And why it is important? Because it affects our practice on because, for example, in the first session the agreement is made, it means that you cannot and also there is also the simplified way, that is part 1, part 2, and also that is a public refuse to admit the occupation and the positions not in the authority bodies. And in fact, it's impossible to, in this case, it's impossible to claim the opposite. So in absentia, the situation is similar, because typically it concerns the cases about the people who are on the territory of the Russian Federation, on the temporarily occupied territories, or they were exchanged as exchanged. So there is a very small chance that there will be the need to reconsider this case, and therefore more cases are considered. Only 10 cases were approved, and typically the court just makes the situation worse. And as for the, and when we're talking about more other tendencies we observed, is that it starts with the legislation and later it is approved in the court. So it's not according to the humanitarian right for the people who are doing the vitally important work on the temporarily occupied territories. Our legislation does not take into account that international humanitarian law does not understand that there should be an order on the temporarily occupied territories, so that the facilities for the children have to continue operating, the communal companies have to continue working, and also all the functions, for example, firefighters and the others have to work, and it is not reflected in our legislation. And as of now, we can see 11 cases punishments for firefighters and 10 for the communal companies, and it's it is very obvious that it doesn't matter what they do and whether they are really the threat for the state. So according to our legislation, they have to be responsible for what they did. Another tendency we were discussing, and now it is proved once again, that is broad formulations which allow to make all the people who work on the temporary occupied temporary responsible. So in the decree of the Supreme Court. So we can see that the person, for the case when the person was a driver on the temporary occupied territory, and it was said that it's no, it doesn't meet Article 7 because this person did not become the employee of the law enforcement body. But if we look at the Part 7, in this case we are talking about the position in law enforcement. And it doesn't mean that this person has to perform law enforcement function. And in this case, we can say that maybe Supreme Court could have interpreted it in the other way, but we have legislation which allows us to interpret this case in this way. And my colleague will tell more about it. And another thing which also has an effect on all of these things, that is the low level of the individual motives to become traitor and the consequences. Because if we consider all these sentences, we will see that it's about taking the position, and it doesn't matter what kind of reasons and what kind of consequences were there. And the latest explanations say that we have to consider this, and we have to consider what kind of position did one have in these bodies. What did this person do? What were the reasons, and what was the ideology behind this work? Because if we consider one of the quite obvious cases, so the person took the position in the sector of the architecture and land, and due to the fact that it did not start operating, this person was working as a cooker in the canteen, and nevertheless this person was sentenced. So all these topics are not studied well, and therefore we have that our practice looks like this. But nevertheless, I would like to come back what we were discussing in the beginning. So the first problem, and what is forming this kind of practice, is legislation, which allows us to interpret these very broadly, and the fact that we do not have the authorities which will allow us to amend these legislation, because the letter from the Prosecutor General is a good example on how the international humanitarian law have to be followed and implemented. But with the current legislation, it's almost impossible to implement it. Thank you, Onisa. And considering the fact that our legislation on cooperation with the enemy has some gaps, and they are quite significant, they have an impact on the life of our citizens under the occupation, and how people under occupation perceive the state, and how they feel. Do they feel safe? In this case, it's also important to talk on how the state hears these comments, first of all from the activists, and we are talking about these not for the first year. And I have the question to Inna Vishnevska. So how the state is ready to respond? How does it understand the seriousness of the problem? What kind of draft law do we have which can improve the situation? Or maybe the state has to do something. Thank you very much for the word. This article was approved, the amendments were made on the 3rd March 2023, and it became the response on what is happening on occupation, and also the growing number of the interaction with the temporary government on the occupied territories. And at the moment we have 16 draft laws on the amendments to the Criminal Code of Ukraine, and that is about the Article 111-1 and the other articles regarding the threats. And as you can see on this slide, at the moment we have 11 draft laws, so that is the biggest number of draft laws out of all analyzed ones, but a bit later about this. The second block of draft laws is on the changes to the regulatory legislation. At the moment we have 2 of them, and they are focused on the list of the types of activities and the number of these activities which are legalized on the temporary occupied territories, and also 3 draft laws that are the draft laws which are related to restricting the rights of people who are sentenced or detained. So what is the status of these draft laws? So now we are going to answer whether the legislation is ready to respond on what is happening in practice, and that is answer to what Ms. Anissa has answered. So as you can see, the number of these draft laws, that is the number of there are 10 draft laws which are passed to the parliament. 2 draft laws were redirected to the committee. 2 more draft laws had got the conclusion, and only 2 draft laws were taken as a basis in the second reading. It seems like 16 is quite a big number when it comes to these kind of concrete question, and none of them is on the final stage of approval and signing it by the president, and so on and so forth. What is the main issue? The biggest issue which we have at the moment, that is a lack of political will of the government for these changes. So typically not the right time. So any kind of amends when it comes to the temporary occupation and limitation of the rights of the people faces the same problem. This kind of answer, not the right time, has bad consequences, not right now, but also for the future. At the moment, we can say that we have lots of sentences, and typically the international humanitarian law is violated, and Geneva Convention, GAC Convention, and the prospects is that the people who are staying on the temporary occupied territories, these people are not getting closer to ours. So people see that whatever the situation is, whatever problem they are facing, anyways, it is going to end up with a criminal responsibility, and doesn't matter whether you were forced or whether that was a critical situation or anything else. So what else can we say? As it was already mentioned, the biggest number of draft laws are related to the Criminal Code of Ukraine. So what do we have in these draft laws? Mainly, that is stricter, strengthened criminal liability. In some of the cases, by the way, they are reasonable. For example, the penalties, when the sanctions foresee only losing the right to get the position, because some certain people do not have any kind of position, and as a result, if the person does not have the right to get the position which this person never wanted to have, no sense. And there are lots of proposals aimed at delimiting Article 111.1 of the Criminal Code from adjacent houses. So, for example, that is grouping by some certain categories, by situation. In the other cases, that is detailization. So that is so they are considering whether it was volunteering or not. So it's not systematic. The next one is what was already said, expanding the concept of collaboration. The person who has the citizenship or the passport of the enemy aggressor country is also the subject of the responsibility, and also establishment of criminal liability for the provision of independent professional services. The next block of the changes, which is, in my opinion, quite reasonable, and it will be really great if it had some political will to change that. That is, first of all, legalization of the provision of public services in the temporarily occupied territories. That is the draft law which was suggested by the Prime Minister, and also legalization of economic activities aimed at ensuring the livelihood of the population in the temporarily occupied territories. So, of course, at some point, these draft laws have some gaps, but nevertheless, the general idea and the concept is quite good. And at the same time, I would like to stop on the third block of draft laws. In my opinion, they are the most interesting one and the most innovative, which we hadn't seen before. The first draft law, you can see the general features of this draft law. The first one is about deprive of the right to recognition as a victim of person who served in the armed forces of the Russian Federation, other than military formations of law enforcement agencies, those who voluntarily held positions related to the performance of organizational, administrative, and economic functions in legal authorities established on temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine, or participated in illegal armed or paramilitary groups, meaning that we have defined these context, and the people cannot be considered to be victims. What is the first thing we can see? That there are last two groups of people that are in fact people who have convicted a crime according to Part 5 or Part 6 of Article 111-1. And in this draft law, there is no explanation on how we can prove the fact that the person had the position or participated. So that should be the sentence of the court, or that is the fact consideration. And in fact, we have the same situation with the first two groups of people, because it's not obvious on how practically we can prove that people were taking some certain positions or partaking in some activities. By the reports of the local authorities, this kind of gap has very big potential problem, which can be used, and the person can pass the materials to the European Human Rights Court, because if there are no kind of explanation how these facts should be proven. And beside that, even if we consider that this person has to be sentenced, but in fact this kind of sentence does not have an impact on the person becoming the victim, of recognition of the person by victim. According to our legislation, Part 1 on of the Article 155, a victim is a person who, according to the criminal court, got the moral, material, and other losses. The only case when the person cannot be recognized a victim, that is a representative of the legal entity, or for example, the person which considers that he or she, as a member of the society, was morally got moral losses. And if the person has had the sentence and fulfilled this sentence, and as soon as this sentence is over, this person is considered to be a person who did not commit any crime. So we have to understand that after the sentence, person has to be considered as a person who convicted the crime, or let's say as it is, and not ignore the requirements we have at the moment. To be brief, the next draft law, in fact, is very similar, but nevertheless it says that the person cannot get the reimbursement for their health and life, and it's violation not of the international standards which guarantee the reimbursement for life and health, and also the requirements of the Constitution, where it is said that the life and health of the human being is highest value. And the third draft law is very interesting as well on the pensions. So in this case, we are talking about the person sentenced to restriction or imprisonment for committing certain crimes against the foundations of national security, the security of society from terrorism, and against peace. This kind of person, according to this draft law, is the subject to reducing the size of the pension to an amount not exceeding the substance for a person who have lost their ability to work. The other case is even more interesting. If the person is a suspect accused of committing a criminal offense against the foundations of national security, this person should will not get the pension. So in this case, we are talking about the person losing this right, because we know that in criminal code, all these kind of limitations on the rights of human rights, that is Article 3 of the criminal code. But at the same time, we are restricting person for what this person hasn't done yet. So we make an assumption that this person could have committed this case. Until we did not prove it, any kind of restrictions or limitations should not happen. So another thing I would like to mention is that even despite the fact that the person that we do not have that in the part 155 according European Court, according to Engel criteria, we can say that this kind of restriction is already punishment. And the last thing, when we are limiting the person and restricting the person due to the crime, to committing crime, or our assumption of for committing a crime, because we have to punish the person of the socially dangerous behavior, and the pension is allocated due to their social contribution, and therefore, are we ready for the changes? No. Are the suggestions interesting? Yes, but unfortunately at the moment we are facing the problem with the political will, and mainly with lack of it, and lack of the unified approach to resolve this issue. Thank you very much, Ina, for your comments, and I would like to move to another block, which is also the part of our complex research, and we wanted to understand how Ukrainian media and websites and social networks are showing collaborationism, because through these kind of messages, Ukrainian society consumes the information on potential collaborators and the processes, and the society through public communication has some certain opinion about this group of people. And now I would like to invite Ms. Weronika Volkowinska, who will introduce the results of the monitoring platform Semantrum, which have conducted the analysis, and they have analyzed hundreds of thousands of messages, and they have analyzed thousands of journalist materials from Ukrainian media. Veronika, could you tell us, please, what did you find? What are the interesting narratives you've seen? The floor is yours. Good afternoon. I'm very glad to be the part of this discussion, and I hope that you can see my screen, my presentation. Thank you. So We have conducted the analysis of the reports on collaboration in the media and law enforcement agencies, and this research consists of two parts. The first one is dedicated to the official pages like the state security and the others, and in the second part we were considering mass media, that are the online media and also traditional media. So we were considering the publications with the key words collaborationism, collaborator, and the names of the article of criminal code. And in the articles, we found negative names as a traitor, betrayer, criminal, collaborator, and so on and so forth. And on the grounds of this analysis, we've seen that there are lots of publications with negative description of the suspects according to the article on collaborationism. As for regional, as we found around 25,000 publications with the keywords, and we can see that in July 2022 we see that the number is increasing, and then despite some fluctuations, the number of them is quite significant every month. All in all, we found lots of publications which have the negative context, and 49% of them contained negative words, such as I already mentioned, betrayer, traitor, and so on and so forth. So typically, in the publications, some certain aspects of the activity of the persons are mentioned, but it's very illustrative that the titles and the beginnings of the posts on social networks are typically, for example, the police officers have kidnapped the man, and in this case we can see that due to the fact that we are talking about a traitor, in this case this person, that we have proved that this person has committed the crime, and at the same time, typically later in the publication, only in the end we can find out what is that the person is just a suspect. Also, we were considering the distribution of these publications on not only due to negative words, but also whether there was some kind of later publications on the sentence and these kind of cases. So we have analyzed the publications, and we've got the results, and we saw that only in 10% cases where we find negative words, we had the information on the sentence. In 90% of cases, there was no information about the sentence. Also, we have analyzed the techniques of concealing the faces. So the analysis, so the blurring of information, and we saw that in 65% of total number of publications with an existing image, these techniques were used, but in 35% the normal photos were used. And also, speaking of the distribution, regional distribution, in this case we can say that the largest number of photo publications without facial concealment techniques was recorded in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, and the biggest number of the biggest number of cases of publications with negative words without a sentence. That was also in Odessa and Kharkivska Oblast. So we can see that typically we have some certain markers of violation of the presumption of innocence, but nevertheless there are some kind of differences, because some regional bodies, official bodies, they are duplicating the information from the publications regarding some other regional events, and it depends typically, and the number of negative posts depends on some certain politicians and how many materials do they publish. Speaking of the monitoring of the national media, regional and national media, just a moment. So I need to stop sharing my screen for a second. I'm very sorry, maybe not all of the slides will be very graphical, but speaking of the content, so in media we found more than 300,000 publications, and out of them we marked the publications with negative words, and all in all we've seen that collaborator, collaborant, is typically used without some specific legal information. So it means that collaborators are those who are the people who do any kind of activity on the temporary occupied territories without any kind of link to the criminal code, or whether they were accused or no information is provided. So typically, media take the information from the law enforcement. For example, we can see the cases when they are referring to the city council. And as for the publications, 42% of the publications contain negative vocabulary related to the description of the persons accused and suspected of committing crimes under Article 111.1. And also, typically, there is no information on the sentence or the court decision resolution. So 95% of publication contain negative description of suspect persons, do not have information about the conviction, that is, proof guilt or for the persons. 5% of the publication that contain a negative description of suspects have information about the presence of a verdict. 69% of full analyzed publications contain negative language, and at the same time do not contain information about the conviction of the suspect. That is, they have markers of a possible violation of the presumption of innocence. So, speaking of the conclusions, we can see that in overall negative context, it is identified in 85% of publications by keywords, and we can see that the policy is quite different, and it can be different even for different sources. And both in media and in the state officials, almost all the sources are using formal formulations, and they can use blurring, and they might not be using blurring. And also we observe the cases when media are taken normal photo, they find it on the internet, and in some cases they are taking the materials from indexating the photo, and if the regional state authority is using some certain techniques, for example, they can add some watermark, like suspect. In this case, media can use this word, and in some cases they remove it. And we can see that there is no general policy, unified policy for the officials and the media, and how to cover this topic, or how to follow all the standards. So we consider that the sources, official sources, can use some negative terms to draw attention of the audience, to draw attention of media, and to form some certain attitude of the people, of the society, to the crimes and violations. Thank you, Veronica. I'm very sorry for those who were watching us. I'm very sorry for the technical issues. And I would like to move to our last block. And I consider that it's the most important part of our research, because first of all, it concerns the people who are now under occupation or used to be under occupation, and that are the people who are the one who are the subject to our Ukrainian legislation. That are the people who, first of all, were the people who were the subject to collaborationism. And in our research, we consider that Ukrainian legislation we have to change, and before we understand who can be the subject to this, we have conducted the facilitated discussions, and who are now partially under occupation, and mainly that is that are from the Zaporizhzhia and Kharkivska Oblast. And I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Maxim, facilitator, who will tell us who can be considered collaborators by the citizens of these Ramadahs who were affected by the activities conducted by the Russian Federation. Why should be people prosecuted or on the territories which are not under the Russian occupation? And what is the request from the society, from Ukrainian society, for the punishment? Thank you very much. And I would like to make one step back and talk about methodology, because that was quite experimental thing. We would try to move back from the classical interviews and focus group and use a dialogue to make some certain cut. And we were doing the portraying of the people, and we were considering gender and age aspect to have the general cut of the audience, and to consider the lens of the perspective and the dialogue connection, which allows us to clarify some certain things and to translate the emotions, because we were working with very emotional things, and to turn it into red lines, to identify these red lines. And it was quite surprising for us that during these 3 years of the full-scale war, we are making the sociological measurements, and what we were always considering the consensus for the deliberated the occupied territories is not the consensus, and the request for the punishment is absolutely different, and therefore we have to make better targeting, because the vision of the perception of justice is a bit different on the territories where people faced violence. And therefore you can see the cut and generalization of all the discussions, and objectively that was quite a difficult process, because when we are talking about collaborationism, it's important to understand that it is in the emotional block, especially for the deoccupied territory. That is not the issue of the criminal actions. That is also the neglect and of some certain context and the social context. And here we can get in some certain trap, in the trap of the emotional discussion and emotional correlation. So that is a very, very strong, very cruel position, and you could have changed your opinion if you have the relatives on the occupied territories, and therefore you have to be very strong, severe against all these people, but you are softer to the person who you know, because it has to be kind of exception, and for the people, other people, it is not understandable. And beside that, if we're talking about the severeness of the perception and what is a driver in this case of the severity of perception of this crime, that is security challenge, and I would say even some distance matters. So that are the occupied territories, which remain the frontline territories, or most likely they can turn into frontline. They have survived occupation. Some of them survived short-term occupation, and some of them are still under long occupation. And for example, Luhansk Oblast, in fact, we've seen the people who were becoming the IDPs for the second time. And these kind of the stage when the lessons were not learned led to the situation when they understood that the punishment should be severe. And what was also very important for me, that despite all these security challenges and emotional perception, when you try to clarify the situation from the expert position, the people themselves were making some kind of calibration. This first wave of emotional understanding and then clarification. I'm very sorry, this kind of logistics company was doing this and that, and this teacher is this and that, but in the evening she teaches in Ukrainian languages without announcing that. So the people who are in the constant contact with occupied territories have these similar experience, and it helps to identify some certain criteria. And in Onisa's presentation, the lack of professional lawyers, the people who have to conduct the professional investigation, the criteria for the participants of all of our meetings, this calibration was happening, and you can see the results of this calibration. And mainly, despite, and that was our assumption, that the length of the occupation can affect strongly. Chernivtsi was, which was less, which was under short-term occupation, Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, which were under long occupation. For example, there is some exceptions. For example, for some logistics companies, it is a relevant thing, but for some of them it's not. And all in all, we can see that that is a thing we try to explain, that there are people who are in the framework of the criminal code, that are those who were building the system, administrative system. They were becoming the heads of the administration. They were organizing the referendums and election campaigns. They created media content. They went to the law enforcement block, and the became the participants of the infiltration events, and I think that you can see the list, and you could have gone through it already. So the things which needed the clarification, that was the matter for the longest discussion, because we were trying to identify what should be the criteria, because criteria, and later I will come back to criteria, but all in all, the law enforcement and executive power and also media content is, according to the criminal code, the livelihood is in the other context. And speaking of the people who have not to be prosecuted, that is getting the documents, staying on the temporary occupied territories, getting the assistance and also humanitarian assistance. And to be honest, the things which have to be clarified, they were migrating quite often from through humanitarian component. Speaking of the criteria, then we have the list to which you clarified the stage. For example, proactivity. The person was the first in this communication and cooperation, or this person was forced to do something. Otherwise, the length of the occupation, the understanding of these actions, and humanitarian component, and depending on the stage, on the level of the degree, and people were understanding how should they identify these things. What the things which maximize size, what we have put in the put here is the feeling that you were betrayed not by causing you some harm, but mainly it's about the security and some certain way of life. We are talking about small ramadas, typically non-urbanized spaces where all the social aspects, some social responsibility and cohesion are important, and the assistance in this or the other way to the army of the Russian Federation led to these kind of things. In addition to that, it's important to mention that the administrative component, media component, participating the military crimes, and here it is an important thing, because people who were given an oath officially were also the part of it, and also we've given you the fact. So that is against the social kata. So that is social-oriented professions, teachers and social workers for the deoccupied territories. That is an important trigger, because that is safety, that is control over children who have the constant contact with children, that is existential threat, and the social contract that you probably do not get the high level of salary, but you have high degree of respect, and these kind of betraying the social contract is important. And what is minimizing the liability? That is sincere confession and forgiveness, cooperation and assistance to the investigation, guerrilla activity in favor of Ukraine. And I would like to show you some kind of things which we observed during this research. That is a key threat that for the society, collaborationism becomes the task for the state. Why? Because that is the liability of the state itself, and partially media component. The central authorities, the head of the country, were using these two to warm up and stabilize the situation, and therefore the request for justice comes to the people who have to be to see the illustrative punishment, and that is the first block. The first block who were participating in infiltration events, who were helping to organize the administration. They left together with the Russian army, and then we have those who do not have the political component. And when we were analyzing the harm, then on the individual level, we saw that the harm was quite obvious and address one. And when we are talking about the national harm, in this case, when understood that the line between the Russian army and collaborators is not obvious. In Gramadas, it goes to one point, and the people who are on the occupied territories, they become the kind of the people who have to satisfy these requests for a punishment. The second thing is that in our opinion, that is some kind of communicational challenge. If the state is, considering the fact how the state leads the process, so maybe we have to consider communicational aspects. Maybe we have to decrease the degree of the temperature of the communication, and also the communication of with the people who left the occupied territories or occupied territory. They have the request for some kind of visibility. They have made the decision. They have chosen Ukraine and sacrificed their life, their everything they had. And does Ukraine show the signal that they were right? No. And how the people who behaved otherwise, they have to be punished. And that is very obvious indicator for the people, and in some of the groups it's not very obvious. But when you're analyzing the narratives and the requests, in this case of the request for the visibility and the appreciation for the state, it's possible to conduct through the punishment tools toward the others, but also you can do that through the tools of appreciation and communication of appreciation, and in addition to that, fixation of what was happening, and that can help them to wait for the justice, the real justice, which will take place towards those who harmed the society, and which is measurable. And it seems like this gap of waiting, we are trying to cover it with the small cases on 3 kilos of meat, about the driver and the others to cover this visibility component. And the last thing, which is, in my opinion, very important, when we're generalizing the vision on all of the territories where we conducted these facilitating meetings, the first response, of course, is a request for the huge non-selective punishment, but the group itself does calibration, and group leads us to the standard level of legal proceedings. So there were law enforcement, there were lawyers, and the people who have their professional perspective, but the people themselves were coming back to the standards of the international law, that there should be kind of definition, and they were building this kind of definition, that there should be some certain action and not just think on the occupied territories. These actions have to be measurable. There should be an intention, an understandable intention to do harm, and also the scale of the harm. And in my opinion, there is a huge challenge for the government to try to balance through the legislation this kind of rotator of justice through the communication as well. When we show the appreciation and step-by-step approach, and in the end we got kind of a schizophrenical decision. First of all, a few articles of the criminal code, because citizens do not understand the legal aspects deeply. And the second of all, the law is a tool. What does the government want to achieve with it? So in 2021, we were talking about the prevention mechanism of some certain new norm for the citizens to become to less become collaborators. Does it work as a prevention for the people who are under occupation for 3 years? Does these two work? And the third of all, it was very obvious in the regions which are which see the regions very closely. Luhanska Oblast, Khersonska Oblast, Luhanska Oblast, which was mainly occupied, that is a request for the reintegration. So the prevention is fast. For quite a long time, we have adequate actions which are with a selective approach, and also messages for the long-term occupied territories. And the state has to understand how it works, because we can consider everything under microscope. We can use microscope to see bacteria. We can use it to hammer the nails, but we can use tools properly. The state has to find the way of the communication which will allow us to resist in the long-term war. Thank you, Maxim. Before we move to the Q&A session, I would like to ask speakers to imagine that the representatives of the government are listening to us, and we are thinking of the people who are under occupation now, or the people who stayed on the occupied territories or the occupied territories, and thinking of these kind of people, thinking that we are watched by someone from the government, and understanding that the state has to be fair in case of collaborators. So what do we want to say? In three sentences, what should the state do right now? That are just your wishes. Do not be afraid to make strong decisions, especially those ones which are aimed on the people from the temporary occupied territories. And please do not be afraid of the exceptions in criminal codes, in criminal liability, in those cases where it is relevant. So in fact, I think that we had a strong request for the state in the last speech. That is the clarification of the situation. People have to understand where is the line of the legal activities, where it is on the level of their survival, and where they are crossing this line. It should be reflected by the legislation for the people, and to understand the consequences of their activities. Without this, we cannot ask the people to stay away from what? And then the issues with the legislation, because all these practical issues with the legislation are originating from the fact that we do not have the clear legislation which has to take into account the standards of the international humanitarian law, and also we have to use an individual approach, and the society had this kind of request. Why one did something, and what kind of position did they have, and what they were doing on these positions. So I think that the last message on the legal clarification and understanding of liability, because when we are working with a dialogue approach, it's quite complex, and I think that there is a risk of becoming the part of the national service, as it's happening typically, and you are not going to dive deeper, and then the understanding of the request of the society. So typically there are people from small settlements and towns, and typically they have the request, okay, what else should we do? So we have chosen Ukraine. We were risking our lives, so we went through tortures, and I've heard how my child was tortured, and what else should I do? I have chosen Ukraine, and I live here in absolutely different conditions. So can the state provide this justice and find the aspect which will cover this issue? That is a question not of the criminal code only, but also that is an issue of the adult discussion, because people are ready for that. When you are providing the tools to find the hype, of course, it leads to destabilization. Thank you, Maxim. Ms. Veronika, if you're with us, if you have a comment, we would be glad to hear you. Thank you. Well, speaking of the media monitoring, I think that in many cases we would like to see monitoring not only with state official bodies, but also the media. That is the communicational policy. That is what we would like to see. So some certain rules of cooperation with the audience. I think that would have been really good. Thank you very much, our dear speakers, and we are ready to the Q&A session. If you have any, please raise your hands. Please, the floor is yours. Greetings. Yeah, I'm from PETSU. Thank you for the complex research with a legal approach and from the perspective of the science. I have the question regarding your research regarding gaps and lack of implementation of the international humanitarian law. So it seems like it was described situation when civilians they are performing their civilian responsibilities, and it concerned also communal companies. So in this research, in this segment of the research, why do we have this kind of problem? Why do we have this kind of collision? Because all in all, Ukraine say that we are fulfilling and we are using the international humanitarian law. So that is it a matter of interpretation or something else? Thank you. Thank you. So it seems to me that so the problem is, in my opinion, law, because how the law is written now, it does not take into account the standards. And our law enforcement works with the current legislation. They are limited in their possibilities to interpret it, and they are working with what they have. And the taking position in the emergency situation services on the temporary occupied territory means being the subject to the criminal court. So the first problem is the legislation, in my opinion, because our legislation is written in the way that there is nothing about consequence. There is no difference between livelihood or some kind of harmful action. So the fact of having the position on the temporary occupied territories is enough. And as a result, we have 11 verdicts for the firefighters. So first of all, that is our legislation, which we have to work with to take into account these standards. Thank you. Can I ask a short clarifying question? Are the conditions taken into account when people feel pressure, when they are forced to do something, when they have the risk to their life? Is it considered to be a kind of softening matters? So in our legislation, we have the matters of forced and volunteering actions. So in some of the cases, it is considered, and as far as I know, in July, after our reporting period, we have two cases. So where it was said, so there are cases, but in most of the cases, the research, we can see that there was not enough pressure. And speaking of the clarification from the prosecutor general, it is said that we have to consider the situation on the occupied territories and the situation of terror in the territory. Nothing is said there. The legislation does not allow that, and it's not considered at all. Thank you very much. PSU, I have more not a question but the comment. You're talking about the emergency situation service servicemen, and I'm working with missing people, and my friend and trainer, she's from Melitopol, and her brother is one of those people who did not accept Russian side, and now she is in captivity in Rostovska Oblast, and the fact that he is there is approved. But what kind of choice do these people have? What kind of choice did those people who worked in these as firefighters of this territory? So you have not many options. So you can be taken to dig the dugouts, or you can be in captivity and you can stay there for 3 years, or you can be punished by your own country. So in fact, you did nothing, but your future is already black and white. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Горбулян, detector media. Detector also has we have I was monitoring Luhansk Oblast, plus we have media collaborators, and the question of collaborationism, in fact, it's not covered enough, not only in Ukrainian media, because typically in Ukraine, that is a reprint of the information from the official Ukrainian sources. And as for the foreign media, this topic is not covered at all. My question is how this research can help to understand the level of the challenges for the Ukrainian society and also for the people living on the temporary occupied territories for the international audience. Veronika, could you answer this question, please? Well, I guess no, because that is outside of our research. It's a system of monitoring. The floor is to Anissa. Let me try to answer this question. It's hard to evaluate, to assess the consequences of the report, especially when it's just published. But we wanted to have a maximum effect on the beginning of the discussion in all of these sectors. And therefore, we had the separate practice with the investigators in different bodies. We were also investigating, we were also studying the draft laws to be able to talk with the parliament, to be able to suggest some other draft laws. We had the study of media to be able to work with media, and beside that we had the research on what is happening in Hromadas, which were occupied, which are close to the occupied territories, to understand their perspective and how they perceive this information. And because we typically see general information, because typically we see general national picture, that is a question where we have to ask the people who went through this experience to understand what kind of request do they have, because their request is the most acute. And we have to work with it. And Maxim was also mentioning that the people have the request just to talk about it, because this is the matter of discussion, and that is the matter of trauma, because they were occupied. But was there any kind of explanation? Yes, you are loyal to Ukraine, you stayed loyal to Ukraine. Those people who stayed on those territories, how they are going to be punished and how we reintegrate them, so they do not have this understanding. That is a communication both on the regional and also on the national level, and therefore I hope that these four different aspects will help us to raise these questions. And I would like to add that we work with media, with Ukrainian media, and we are trying to work with foreign media. And recently, we had a closed discussion with Ukrainian media on how media are writing about collaborationism, on the narratives which we have named today. And speaking briefly, we've heard the feedback from Ukrainian media that it's quite important event for them, this discussion, and they understand that the level of the investigative journalism leaves something to be desired. In fact, we do not have that many medias which work with the court journalism, or media which draw attention to some kind of court proceedings. And in fact, these kind of closed discussions we had, it was quite efficient, because we were talking with the representatives of respected media, and I know that in our plans, we have the closed meetings with the representatives of the state official authorities, which are responsible for the informational policy. And we hope that our research will be efficient, and we will continue working with this, and we invite Ukrainian media not to avoid the court proceedings regarding Ukrainians, to write about it, because they are our citizens and they need our support, especially those ones which are just accused, suspected, and those people whose guilt was not proven. These kind of people need our support, and therefore let's follow these cases, and sometimes because quite often they are very complex and difficult. Maybe you have another questions. I have another question as a kind of follow-up. There are cases when foreign journalists are attending the occupied territories and they are writing, they are repeating the Russian propaganda, how Mariupol is being reconstructed. There are the journalists from NATO countries, from Spain, from Germany, and is it possible to continue this topic? Because, in fact, the occupied territories, temporary occupied territories, in media discourse, in Ukrainian media discourse, it's internal one, because yes, of course, there are different journalists, and journalists are writing about that, but I have a kind of combination of international journalism and Ukrainian journalism. So maybe we have to think about it. But in my opinion, I'm interested in your opinion. The main challenge which we have nowadays when it comes to the informational policy and communication, when we're talking about the temporary occupied territories, there is lack of responsibility. That we have law enforcement, there are the Ministry of Reintegration, the State Security Service, but all of them, they are promoting their own agenda, and there is no common strategy. Thank you for this question. We are not the organization which can control media or somehow can assess their work, beside the cases which we mentioned today. And with all my respect to Detector Media, the Institute of Mass Information, I suggest to have a common research on the conditions of enthusiasm, because we understand that nobody is going to conduct this work. That is work of the NGOs. So I suggest to unite together and do this work together. So I suggest to finalize our meeting. If there are no further questions, we have also the questions, the last question, because we have to finish our meeting. Greetings. Thank you. Very great presentation. Kyiv National University of Architecture. On the page 26 of your report, in the context of the understanding of part 4, we are talking about the fact that there is a single case where in the resultative part, the convict was made during 15 days after the sentence to make the contribution, 1 million hryvnia contribution to United 24. Could you give a comment on this case, please? I think that we can say no comments, but in fact, yeah, that was one of the vivid cases of the creative approach to some sentences, and especially the processes. So typically they happen in part 4, because that is economical part of the article on collaborationism, and therefore it's about the material component, because that is responsibility or passing the material sources, and also the punishment includes penalty. But what was suggested in this case is penalty. The question is whether it is possible to have this kind of degree of creativity in the state courts decisions, resolutions. So that is an open question, because the the judges did not have any kind of doubt that they can have this kind of resolution, but we have to pay more attention to to part 4, and due to lack of time I did not analyze how often the property arrest and detention is happening in part 4, and typically that is 7 and up to 12 months, and then you have the sentence with trial and very what were the. So I'm going to leave this question open. So we have very last question that was before translation. Lisa, I guess that is a question for you. How do you assess the defending side defense? You mean? So as far as I understand, that is a question regarding so mainly that is a question of our previous research, and there we had the interviews with law enforcement and also the lawyers who are representing the lawyers in this case who work in these cases, and as well as with the analysis of media and law enforcement, we cannot say that we have some certain strategy which we can analyze, assess, and criticize. It depends on each and every lawyer who works with these kind of cases. There are some certain cases when in some region there is a lawyer mainly are taking these kind of cases, and they are not diving deep in it. They are just going through all the stages of the court proceedings, and they are closing the questions. But there are other cases when the lawyers are very serious about each and every case, where they, even when it is the in absentia proceeding, they are trying to defend their defendees, and that is absolutely individual approach. The only thing we have to mention, and once again, that is what was mentioned, that the lawyers, it's difficult to work for the lawyers because there is a pressure from the society. There is the association that the lawyer represent, like he's the same as defendee, and also when we have the cases when there is very small possibility that they can prove something, especially when he's not able to provide support. So maybe the last question. Thank you, Daria Grasod. I have the question regarding block 4 on your dialogue, but maybe you can answer my question. So what are the factors on the perception of the leaders, those who are conducting the collaborationism activities? So I will be very brief because I'm the consumer of this product. There was a question regarding the territories which were under occupation for a long period, because in this area, because there is illusion of the Russian society, and because that is about the organization, and there is a request for these kind of things because that is a kind of shame. So we are demonstrating that there is some kind of civil society, that there are some factors, that there is some kind of impact on the state policy, and people have the negative reaction. And then that is what was mentioned about Mariupol reconstruction, when they are showing the picture of what is not happening there, but that is changing the perception of what is happening on these territories, especially in the foreign media who have no contact with these people. Thank you. We are going to finalize our meeting. I would like to thank all the people who were watching us offline and online. I would also like to thank the Fund of Cooperation for the organizing of this event. And let's continue our work. Glory to Ukraine. Slava Ukraini!